Hi there. Thanks for coming. And today we're talking about what creates accountability in the workplace. And we've got a really nice roll up today. So thank you for that. And obviously this is a topic of interest. And let me just dive straight into it. First of all, just going to talk about accountability and personal responsibility. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is the fact that they're different. A lot of people use the terms interchangeably, and I think there is a difference, and we'll explore that a little bit further. And then you're going to see the personal responsibility model, which is an integro-conceptual model developed by Dr. Ralph Colby, one of our founders. Some of you may be familiar with that because I use it quite frequently. And also the change cycles. I think that's very relevant as well, because when you're asking someone to be accountable for something, it could be a change for them. And we need to understand how and why people respond the way they do to change. All right. And then that will introduce us to the subject of flexibility. I'm going to be talking a lot about leadership today and the need for leaders to be highly flexible. And then we've got some research that we've done on what are the needs that people have in order to be passionate about what they do and the organization they work for. Because when people are really passionate and have a high level of trust for their organization and their leaders, they're far more willing to take responsibility and be accountable for what they do. And bottom line is that to be successful at doing that, we need to have a high level of trust. And so we'll sort of finish off talking a bit about trust. Okay. All right. So what is accountability? Accountability is people actually taking ownership. Someone who knows they're accountable for something, takes ownership on making sure they do the best that they can and get it done, basically achieve the results. But it's not as simple as that. And I think I would like to go into the personal responsibility model because that'll really help us to get clear about the difference between responsibility and accountability and why we need both, obviously. Okay, so before I ever present the personal responsibility model to a group of people, and that's usually I'm presenting that to leaders, and I've presented it to thousands of leaders over the last, well, probably 40 years, but more specifically the last 20 years. And when I've been focusing more on leadership development. And before I present it to them, I always ask the question, what kinds of people do you need in your team or your organization to be successful? All right. And these are the kinds of words that they come up with. And when I ask this question, if it's a face-to-face session, which it mostly always has been until recently, it would be a flip chart. And I would just gather their responses to what kinds of people they need. And if you have a look at those words that have come up, I think you can say, well, yes, I need those kinds of people too. All right. And it's the same words every time. All right. I spoke at a conference in Chicago a few years back when I was living over in the States, and I was invited to speak at a labor management conference, and it was a combination of labor leaders and HR leaders who were attending the conference to figure out how to work together better. And so I was asked to present, and I presented this model here, and I asked them the question, what kinds of people do you need in your organization? And they came up with exactly the same words. The labor leaders wanted the same kinds of people as the HR directors wanted. Okay, so this is always very consistent. Okay, so let's have a look then at the personal responsibility model. You may be familiar with the term locus of control. That is, where is the center of your control? Is it external to you? Does that you don't have control yourself? Your life is controlled by external factors. Or an internal locus of control would be, I'm in control of my own life. Now, when Ralph Colby, one of our founders of Integro in the States, came up with his version of the model, he described them as other-directed or self-directed people. An other-directed person sees themselves as being controlled by the authorities in their lives. All right, and the self-directed person sees themselves as autonomous. Now, it turns out autonomous comes from ancient Greek. Auto means self, nomos means a law unto myself, all right? And so the basic belief that determines whether you are other-directed or self-directed is whether you believe you have to and if you believe you have to, that you have no choice because authorities are telling you what to do, then you will operate in another directed way. If you believe that you always have a choice, I choose to do what I do, I choose to work where I work, I choose to be with who I am with, then you are self-directed. Okay. And you can think about it this way too. When you leave home in the morning to go to work, do you feel like you have any control over your life? Right? Because some people leave home in the morning and are sort of really anxious about what's going to happen today. Because they're anxious about how they're going to handle what's going to happen, and they have maybe no choice about what's going to happen in a lot of respects. The person who's self-directed leaves home in the morning, and they may know that there's going to be some surprises today. They don't know that they can control everything that's going to happen, but they know that they control how they handle everything that's going to happen. All right. So I want to explore the other directed person first, and we're going to look at their thinking that follows on from that belief, how that affects their feelings and their attitude and then their behavior. What are the thoughts that the other directed person has? Let's say you're asking them to do something that's not part of their job description. The immediate thought is, oh, I have to, or why do I have to? And so the thinking will be to either comply, I have to do what I'm asked to do, what I'm told to do, or no way, I shouldn't have to do this. It's not my job. Okay, the feeling that flows on from that thinking is, in the case of comply, to resent, and in the case of rebelling, resisting. Okay, so the person who complies goes away and does it, but there's a sense of resentment there. It's not my job. Why should I have to do this? I've got enough on my plate, etc. And the person whose thinking is to rebel, they just resist doing it. They may not come out and say, no way, I'm not doing it. They just don't do it. You come back and check with them later and say, oh, I haven't had time, I'm too busy. But they're actually just resisting doing it. I'm sure you've had that experience with people. The attitude overall is, I'm not responsible. All right. It wasn't my job in the first place, and they don't want to accept responsibility for the outcome. So if you're not happy with the job that they do, if they do eventually do it, they don't want to accept responsibility for that, and they'll have lots of excuses. And they'll be blaming other people or situations or time. There are always some reasons why they didn't meet your expectations. Okay, so the behavior that we see here is people acting like victims, feeling sorry for themselves, whinging and complaining, or getting revenge, right? Getting even. And so this is a fairly natural way of responding to a situation where you have no control and you're being controlled by an authority. All right. Now, we can all remember growing up with our parents, right? Now, it depends what kind of parents you had, whether they were authoritarian or maybe not. I grew up with a very authoritarian father. Eventually did get him to do a disc profile, and he was a DC style, which is the most task-oriented of all the styles, and very controlling, very strict. My parents were also Salvation Army officers, and the Salvation Army is a very strict religion. All right, it is a great charity as well. They provide a lot of charity, but it is a religion, and so to some extent, it's a Salvation Army, and it felt a bit like a military camp at times at home, where Dad was very strict and had all these very strict rules. And if you didn't obey, then you got into trouble. Mum had a wooden hairbrush, which is the main choice of punishment, as I recall. And yet, for some reason, very early in my life, I decided to rebel rather than resist. What did you do? Were you more likely to comply when you were being told to do something you didn't want to do, or did you rebel? And in my case, if my father told me not to do something, I felt compelled to do it as soon as his back was turned. Funnily enough, most times I got caught and then got the punishment. But I just had this rebellious instinct, which actually stuck with me quite a long way through my life. It wasn't until I actually saw this model for the first time, which was in August of 1977, when I had just joined Integro and went to my first Integro conference overseas. And Ralph Colby presented this model. And I've mentioned Ralph Colby a lot. He was one of the founders and the source of all of these conceptual models for us. Okay. And so when I saw this model for the first time, it was like, oh my God, I'm still rebelling against my father. Yeah, it's quite common. Okay. And as kids, when we're growing up, we've got lots of authorities in our lives, and we've got parents, and we've got teachers, and we've got preachers, and maybe nuns, and you name it. So we've all had a lot of experience of this. All right. And what I found is anytime someone speaks to me in an authoritarian way, it triggers a reaction. I don't necessarily react outwardly because I'm aware of what's going on, but my natural instinct is to go back to that rebellion feeling. Okay, so let's look at the other side, the self-directed person. You're going to ask them to do something that's not part of their job description, and they know that they've got a choice. All right, so their thinking is to agree or disagree. All right, and so if it's a reasonable request, there's every likelihood that they're going to agree to do it. If it's not a reasonable request, then they could disagree. Okay. And the thing that's interesting in some organizations is that authoritarian leaders tend to see disagreement as rebellion. And it's something that we really need to learn as leaders. We need to encourage people to disagree. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. Okay. The feeling that they have, whether they agree or disagree, is one of acceptance of the consequences. If they agree to do something, they agree to do it and do it well. They accept that. I own this. Right. If they disagree, they'll accept the consequences, and there could be some negative consequences, but they'll accept that. They're not going to go into blaming other people or whinging and complaining like this other directed person would, because their attitude is, I am responsible for the decisions and actions that I take or make. Okay, and so that's where responsibility comes in. It's an attitude, it's a belief that I am responsible for this, and then I will be accountable. I'll actually do it. Okay. And so that's where I see the difference is. And so we're not going to get accountability until people take responsibility willingly. And you can't actually force people to be responsible or accountable. All right. You can tell people, I'm holding you accountable for that. But they won't be accountable for it unless they take it on themselves and take responsibility for doing it, and doing it the way that's expected of them. All right. So what this tells us is using authoritarian behavior does not produce accountability. In fact, it produces the opposite of that. Okay. Now you will find self-directed people being responsible and accountable in an authoritarian work environment. Why? Because they're choosing to own what they do. All right. They're choosing to be there. Okay. I don't know how many times you've been talking to someone who doesn't like their job, and they're complaining about it, how terrible the place is and all that kind of stuff. Now, if you ask them, well, why are you still there? Chances are their response is going to be, well, I can't leave. I have to stay. I have to earn money. I have to do this. It's too hard. In other words, they don't like the consequences of the decision of leaving. And so they stay, but then they still wallow in their resentment or resistance or victim and revenge. Okay. So the most common form of revenge, I believe, in the workplace today is people doing the quiet quitting. I was just reading a Gallup article this morning. Quiet quitting is when people stay and do just as little as they have to keep the job. All right. That's the most common form of revenge. We also call that disengagement. People switch off. All right. And that's their way of getting even for the workplace. Okay. Now, what that tells us is that if we really want people to be accountable, we've got to create a work environment where they can have a choice, where they are involved in discussions and decisions about choices and given reasons why things need to be done a certain way. Now, some of you obviously, and a lot of people work in an environment where there's very strict laws, even legislation, strict policies and procedures, and healthcare, for example, be one, and things have to be done correctly. Okay, well, that's great, and most people are happy to do that. But if they're being managed in a way that's very authoritarian and punishing if there's mistakes, it's very difficult for them to stay on that self-directed side. Okay, most people will choose to do the right thing. Okay, I'll talk more about that in just a little while. Okay, so when I've been through this model with a group of leaders, I will then go back to the flip chart, assuming I'm in a meeting with them, and I'll go back to those words that they came up with. And then I ask them, what do these words describe? An other-directed person or a self-directed person? And I've never had anyone come up with any words when I asked them what kind of people they needed that described other-directed people. It's always self-directed people. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Who wants other-directed people working for them who won't take responsibility for anything, who always got an excuse when the job isn't done properly, always blaming other people, always whinging and complaining, etc. Who wants that? Okay. Now, I want to refer you to a book on this very subject called Learned Optimism. Some of you may have already got it and read it. Martin Seligman is a professor at University of Pennsylvania, I think it is, in Philadelphia. He's actually the father of positive psychology, they call him. Okay. And he wrote this book after, when he was still a young psychologist, and been studying depression. And what he discovered was that the main psychological reason that people got depressed was that they learned helplessness, right? And so he figured, well, if they learned it, they can unlearn it. And so he said about identifying ways in which people could learn to be more optimistic. So just very briefly, he describes two explanatory styles, one being pessimism and one being optimism. The pessimistic explanatory style is that you explain what's happening around you, what's happening to you, in a pessimistic way, and use words like, "Oh, that always happens to me. I'm never good at this." Or if you're optimistic, you have an optimistic explanatory style that you explain things optimistically. Well, I'm not good at that, but I'm really good at these other things, right? And so there's a really good questionnaire in the book that you can use to measure what your explanatory style is, and there's various components in that. So I just really think this is a great book if you want to explore this subject a little bit further, and it will really help you identify ways in which you can help people be more accountable and understand the people who resist it a bit better as well. Okay, so I mentioned I'd talk to you about the change cycles. All right, this is another Integro conceptual model from Dr. Ralph Colby. And I want to share with you because it explains a lot about why people may or may not be willing to be accountable. All right, because accountability and changes in what you're accountable for happen because of changes in the organization. Problems arise, right? Which is why I've got problem there with change. When something changes, it's typically a problem that's caused the change, and people react to that the same way. That is, they react to change and problems the same way. So I'm going to deal with a negative response first, and that is when we see change as a threat. All right. And if we see change as a threat, that's the attitude towards it, then our behavior will be defensive. Now, we're all familiar with the survival instinct, right? And we call that a maintenance cycle, by the way. We're trying to maintain things the way they are. All right. And we all go into a maintenance cycle when we're threatened, whether it's a physical threat or simply a psychological threat, or the way someone spoke to you, was a threat to your ego. And most of the maintenance cycle behavior we see in organizations is ego survival. All right. And so we see fight, flight, and freeze responses there. Okay. When you're in a maintenance cycle, who are you focused on? Or where are you focused? And the answer is you're focused on yourself. All right. Your focus goes inwards because you're feeling threatened. You're thinking about how you feel and how you think and what you need and what you really want. And the change may be out there, but you're not seeing it, right? Because you're looking internally. Okay. And so one of the key things to being more effective, and I might add here, by the way, that the behaviors or the feelings and behaviors that we use in a maintenance cycle are quite negative. You know, feeling frustrated, anxious, concerned, fear, and defending yourself and arguing and getting into conflict. So a conflict between two people is typically two people in a maintenance cycle. Ugly conflict, not productive conflict. Okay. And so the most important thing, why these models are so valuable, is that it helps people become more aware of what they're doing. All right. So we're raising self-awareness when people say, oh my God, I'm in a maintenance cycle. Okay, I have a choice now. Once I know that I'm there and I'm recognizing it, or my favorite term is, isn't it interesting? Why am I reacting so defensively to this, right? So now what can I do? I can then start to look for the opportunity. What can I learn from this, all right? And get myself into a growth cycle, okay? And then when I'm in a growth cycle, I will behave constructively. Okay, so we think about this. I'm asked to take responsibility for something, and my first feeling might be it's a threat. I might. What if I don't do it well? What if I get into trouble, etc. And as soon as I realise that I'm there, okay, well, what's the opportunity here? What's the positives that can come out of this? And that will get me into a growth cycle, and it'll get people to be more willing to take on responsibility and accountability. Okay, and so I find this a really helpful model in helping people transition through the challenges that are going on in the workplace and the change that's happening in the world and in their lives. Is what's the opportunity here? And I've heard stories of I remember one young guy in particular on the northern beaches here in Sydney who had some melanomas, and he was given only a few months to live. This is like 30 years ago, and he spent the last few months of his life going around the beaches with sunscreen and asking all the young people if they were wearing sunscreen, rather than curling up a little ball and waiting to die. Okay, so he got into a growth cycle and did something constructive. All right, so in more recent years, we've been learning about neuroscience. Okay, so here's a little graphic I found, and I just want to tie that into the change cycles here. When someone reacts a certain way to change, it's the way they react is based on deep set memories, long-term memories and emotional responses that they've learned throughout their life and probably been doing throughout their life. All right. And I think one way of looking at that is to tie that in with DISC. I know most of you will be familiar with DISC. So what a D reacts defensively to is going to be very different to what an S style reacts defensively to, right? And vice versa. Okay. So what we react to will be affected by our memories and the recordings we've got about how the world is and how it should be and all that kind of stuff. Okay, and so when we see something as a threat, that triggers the amygdala, which is responsible for the response and memory of emotions and especially fear. Now, what I learned was that the amygdala is constantly scanning what's going on around us, looking for threats. All right, and if it sees a threat, reacting to that. Okay, so when I go into a maintenance cycle and I see something, I react to it. I do have a choice at that point. I can physically react to that and get defensive and argue and yell and carry on or something. But I can then say, "Oh, isn't that interesting? I'm feeling really threatened by that, or I'm feeling really anxious about that. What's going on here?" All right, and that will help to connect with the prefrontal cortex, right? Which is where we regulate our thoughts and actions, and obviously extensive connections with our brain parts, but to make a decision. All right, so there's the awareness of the emotion there. The emotion might still be there, but actually making a choice about my reaction. I need to do that in order to get into a growth cycle. Okay, does that make sense? And just thought I'd add another little slide here about the current language we tend to use. A lot of people use this, talking about fixed mindsets and growth mindsets. And I think adding that change cycles model to understanding where that's coming from. How do I get into a growth mindset? I've got to start looking for opportunities, right? How do I get into a fixed mindset? I go inward and feel threatened and shut down and try to keep things the way they are. Okay, so there's a close relationship between that and the personal responsibility model, right? And that's important when we start thinking, well, how do I get more people to be self-directed? Okay, the people who are other directed will spend more time in a maintenance cycle than a growth cycle because they don't have any control. And when something happens, it's oh my God, here we go again, another change, another problem, and they end up reacting in another directed kind of way. Okay. So in order to get people to be more self-directed, we also need to help people learn to be more opportunity focused to get into a growth cycle. Okay. Now, in the email that went out to you, I talked about two aspects of personal responsibility I wanted to talk about today, and I've already started talking about them. The first one was your personal responsibility as a leader for the environment you create. All right. As you can see from the personal responsibility model, the environment you create will have a big impact on whether people feel that it's safe to take ownership, whether it's safe to be self-directed, to speak up when they don't agree. All right. And you can also create an environment where there's fear, an authority-driven environment where there's a high level of control and punishment for mistakes and things like that. Okay. And obviously to do that requires creating a psychologically safe environment. All right. And trust is a huge part of that, as we'll talk about a little bit later. The other thing I said we'd talk about is how to get other people to willingly take responsibility and be accountable. And when we've already started talking about that too, we need to create an environment where it's safe for people to be self-directed, for them to take ownership. And that requires, well, trusting them to be involved in decision making and to be willing to speak up when they don't agree with something. Okay. So that requires a high level of flexibility, right, on the leader's part, right? But it requires a high level of flexibility on the employee's part too, right? We need a high level of flexibility for everyone. But I've got an interesting definition of flexibility here, and it's one that Ralph Colby came up with 50 years ago. And I've been using it ever since, and it's still as relevant today as it's ever been. And that is the ability to relate to people in such a way that their needs are at least as important as yours. Now, that might seem a little unusual. You'd be thinking about people who are adaptable and flexible and all that kind of stuff. But if you think that your needs are more important than other people's needs, you're going to be focused on yourself. All right. The only way you can be seen as being flexible by other people is to be willing to see their needs as important as yours. All right. And you know that when you're working with someone, and you may be working with someone now, I have recently worked with somebody, they weren't the least bit interested in what your needs were. It was just always about what they wanted to get, what they wanted to achieve. All right. That sort of is a switch off for you, isn't it? And it certainly is for me. So to create an environment where people are willing to be self-directed because they want to be self-directed, right? And to take the risk of being self-directed, they've got to know that you've got their back, right? And that their needs are as important to you as their own needs, okay? So I want to share with you another model that really is focused in on that. What are the needs that people have that we need to focus on? All right. And you know, we all know DISC. Well, hopefully all of you know DISC. And we know that the different styles have different psychological needs. All right. And that's important. But there are some psychological needs that all people have when they come to work that need to be satisfied. And if you as a leader focus on satisfying these needs, you're going to have a bunch of highly motivated, passionate people who trust you and are willing to go the extra mile for you and take on responsibility and accountability, et cetera. So, okay, we call it the passion pyramid. All right. This came out of some research I did when I was doing some work with the University of Wisconsin. And through the conversations I was having with them and the questions that they had about how do they apply these leadership skills, we came up with these 5 needs. All right. The first need that employees have is to be respected. Now, really? No surprise. All right. And it doesn't matter what generation they're from. All right. All people need to be respected. And so when people do know that they are respected, that's where engagement starts. People will switch on and be more interested when they know that their leaders respect them. All right. And the skills that leaders need to have, which is the left-hand side of this model, is people skills. They need to know how to build trust, how to deal with people, and how to deal with different people differently. So we need to find out what the needs are that people have to be respected. Okay. The second need is to learn and grow. Now, everybody has a need to learn and grow. Some people have switched it off, but it was there. We know that because you've only got to watch little children once they get mobile and learning to walk and getting into everything. Curiosity is huge, all right? And they're always wanting to learn something. okay, and to grow as an individual. It's a natural need that we all have, right? Now, leaders can encourage that by being effective at coaching, counseling, and mentoring, all right, and working with people to help them learn and grow. And when we do, we end up with more talented, more skillful employees, okay? The third need is to be an insider, to be on the same side as my boss, not an us and them situation, right? And for that, leaders need to be inclusive and treat everybody as an insider. Now, I've had this model, when did I create this? I've been back in Australia since 2009, so it's probably 15 years ago, all right? So we weren't talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity and all that kind of stuff back then. This is and psychological safety, but being inclusive is including everybody. It's making sure that everybody feels like they're part of the team. Where someone on a team can be working on a project with a senior manager because they're included and their skills are valued. Okay, and that really increases commitment and engagement in an organization. Okay, the fourth skill is to do meaningful work. Daniel Pink's book Drive talked about the importance of purpose. All right, and so the most powerful way of getting people to see what they're doing is meaningful is to connect what they're doing to the purpose of the organization or to the purpose of what the team does. All right, it's meaningful. We're doing something that's making a difference, but also having some values that they share, that they talk about, and everybody's operating by those values. And there's a vision of where we're going to go. They're the things that really build meaningful work. And that's when employees really start to feel more emotionally connected to the organization, right? And then the fifth need is to be on a winning team. People want to be successful, right? They don't necessarily be competitive and individual winners. But they do. Everybody has a need to be on a winning team. All right. And we know that because we've got a survey that measures all this stuff. All right. So leaders need to focus on how do I build my team into a high-performing team, and I'm going to talk about how we can do that, and it's part of my wrap-up. And when all these five needs are met, people are passionate about what they do, but also passionate about the organization. And we've also shown through the research that we've done that passionate people have a high level of trust for their managers and for the organization. All right. These five needs correlate very strongly with our trust model. So when we survey people in an organization and we ask them how important these needs are to you personally, the average score is 9 out of 10 for all 10 questions. There's 2 questions for each of the 5 needs. So 9 out of 10 importance. So these needs are important basically to everybody, right? And if they're not, look at the environment, what's causing the need to be switched off because of the environment. The environment might be killing their engagement and their passion, right? In other words, the environment's not satisfying these needs. So the question I'm often asked is, do people really want to be accountable? I've got a lot of people who don't want to be accountable. They don't want to take any responsibility. They want to avoid responsibility, etc. Well, in that survey and in the trust section of the survey, there are 2 questions we asked that's measuring reliability is obviously one of the key foundations of trust, all right? And one of the values that drives reliability is keeping commitments. You know, we're not going to get reliable results if people don't keep commitments. And so in the trust section of the survey, we ask 8 questions. And for each, we actually have 8 items that we measure, and we ask 2 questions. The first question is, how important is this to you personally? And so what people are responding to in that survey is people follow through on their responsibilities. How important is that to you personally? The average score in over 20,000 surveys is 9.5 out of 10. All right. So in other words, people are saying it's really important to me to follow through on my responsibilities. And everybody should be following through on their responsibilities. And of course, that's what we expect and what we want, isn't it? In any organization, for people to do their jobs. And then not just to do their jobs, but to do it to the best of their ability. So the second question we have there is about seeking excellence, striving to do our best in everything we do. And again, the average score is 9.5 out of 10. All right. Now, out of the 8 values that we measure, one of them is honesty, being honest and ethical in everything we do. That scores a 9.6 out of 10. And again, that shouldn't surprise you. All right. But it really surprised me initially when we first got our set of data to see these scores at 9.5 out of 10, and they've stayed there. This is in 15 years. We've been measuring this. And every time we run an analysis of the results of the surveys we've gathered recently, we see 9.5 out of 10 every time. Okay. So in other words, people want to follow through and they want to do their best. So when you get a cynical leader telling you that people don't really want to work hard, they just want to come to work and do the least they can. Well, that's what quiet quitting's about, isn't it? All right. So if people are doing that, if they're not striving to do their best, it's not because they don't believe in it, it's because of the way the work environment's affecting them. All right. And so it's not the work, it's the workplace that affects people's motivation to do their best. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up with the 5 behaviors model, because you can see staring at us there is accountability. All right. And how do we get people to be more accountable? Well, we don't just start at accountability. You know, you just don't, well, I've seen it happen, and you probably have too, where an authoritarian manager says to somebody, I'm holding you accountable for that. Right. And so that's an authoritarian move. It's a demand of accountability. Okay. If it's done in that way, of course, and it's not that we shouldn't let people know that they're accountable for certain things, but it's how we go about it and what's the environment behind that. Right. So as the 5 behaviors model, it's just from Patrick Lencioni's book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and we flip the dysfunctions around into the behaviors, and that's part of the program that Wiley have developed in conjunction with Lencioni, and it's got DISC built into it as well. All right, so it doesn't start with accountability, it starts with trust. All right, because if we haven't built trust in the team, then we're not going to have the productive conflict, the discussion about and making decisions about what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. So when teams are able to engage in constructive or healthy conflict, it's because they've got a high level of trust, and people will open up and they will say, I disagree. All right. And that comes back to being self-directed, doesn't it? Being willing to disagree. And people will when there's a high level of trust. Right. And when everybody's had their say and everybody's spoken up, and then they come to making a decision, and now we can get a commitment because we've got everybody's input, and people are more willing to commit to something where they've had their say. Right. And one of Pat Lencioni's comments, he talks about commitment being both clarity and buy-in. You've got to be clear about something before you can commit to it. And if you're not clear, you need to speak up, which means you need to engage in healthy conflict to be able to challenge things and question things. But you also need buy-in. People don't have to agree with every decision that's made, but they need to commit to making the decision work. They need to buy into it. And as Pat says, people won't buy in unless they've weighed in to the discussion. All right. And once people have committed to a decision, well, then we can expect accountability. All right. If everyone's committed to do something to make this decision work, to act on it, and then it's not happening, well, what's happening? Is there a lack of commitment, or did we not get the commitment in the first place? All right. So accountability comes in at the right place here. People are more willing to hold each other accountable. And that's what we're talking about in the 5 behaviors model. It's not just boss to subordinate accountability, it's peer-to-peer accountability. Okay. And of course, only through all of that can we achieve the best results that we can. Okay. All right. So in summary, people inherently want to be responsible and accountable. All right. People want to be self-directed. Reminds me of a story. I was running a workshop in San Diego area many years ago, and I had a Wiley consultant there who'd flown over from Hawaii for it. And one of the participants said, when I'd gone through the personal responsibility model, how young can kids be before they can learn to be self-directed? And I said, well, based on my experience with my kids, a lot earlier than we probably think. And Sarah, who was from Hawaii, spoke up and said, well, actually, I can give you an example. And she had a 4-year-old son called Trey, and she'd been to the park with him a little while earlier, and she said, I've been trying to teach him that he's got options. He can make decisions, but there are consequences for decisions. Like if he's too tired, he doesn't want to go to bed, right? And she'll say, well, if you don't go to bed now, you're going to be tired when I wake up in the morning to go to kindy, right? And so she was helping him see the consequences of his decisions and actions. Okay. Anyway, she was at the playground and he's climbing on this climbing apparatus, and Sarah calls him down and says, time to go home. And he didn't come down. So she called him a couple more times, getting more insistent. And his response was, I don't have to, I've got choices, right? And so he had learned that he had choices, and he was being self-directed. But of course he had to come down and they had to go home. But so it's natural behavior. It's natural in tendency for human beings to want to be self-directed and be in charge of their own lives, okay? And if they're not, it's because of the way they've been programmed, right? And I've seen situations where parents are so strict and make all the decisions for people right through high school, university, etc., telling them what to do, and they have no confidence in their ability to make decisions. So it'd be terrifying for them to be self-directed, okay? That'll be tragic. Okay, people want to be self-directed. Secondly, leaders must create a psychologically safe environment where people can be self-directed. All right, and the foundation of that is trust. Okay, the key to that is a high level of trust, as we talked about in the 5 behaviors model. Okay, all right. So we're going to throw it open to questions. I see we've only got one question in the Q&A box at the moment. I can still choose to agree or disagree with an authoritarian leader, and a democratic authoritative leader can still read disagreement as rebelliousness. What is the evidence that links authority, compliance leader behavior, and whether we are self or other directed? That's a good question. We measure culture through our employee passion survey, which measures the level of passion and the level of trust that employees have. And we break the results down by department or teams, business units, etc. And we see significant differences in different departments, right? And when I sit down with the senior leaders, usually the CEO and HR director, to go through the results before we disperse them through the organization, I typically will ask, which departments or which business units do you think will score best in terms of passion and trust, and why? And then which departments do you think will score lowest in passion and trust, and why? And it always comes back to the leader. They'll say, well, that's group's not going to score very low because the leader of that group is not very people oriented and very controlling and task oriented and so on. Right? I know that's not scientific research, but Gallup have a lot of research as well. And in fact, it's probably 2 years ago now, they published their book, It's the Manager. It's the manager that has the biggest impact on employee engagement and trust. Okay, and that's one of the biggest research studies that they've done, and certainly still recent enough to be very relevant to today. Okay, no more questions. So thank you very much for coming. I see a lot of you are still here. Oh, here we go. What is the best thing leaders can do to build trust? Satisfy these needs. Okay. The survey that we use, the Employee Passion Survey, has 10 questions that measure the degree to which these needs are being satisfied. And there's 8 questions measuring the 8 values that build trust. So measuring the trust level at a very deep level. And what we found is that there's an extremely strong correlation between the need satisfaction of these 5 needs and the level of trust. In other words, and as the psychometrician who did the analysis for us said, it makes sense. If you satisfy people's needs, they trust you. If you don't satisfy needs, they don't trust you. One question just came in. What do you think is a good way to reintroduce the concept if we have been talking about culture transformation for years? I'd ask people about how would you describe our culture? But quite frankly, the best way would be to measure it. And the Employee Passion Survey is a great way to measure that. It's only 22 questions, but it's very powerful. It's a deep dive into the psychology of what's going on in the organization, and particularly into the trust level and the need satisfaction areas. Okay. All right. Thanks, William. Appreciate the question. And thank you all for coming.